Hello, everyone, and welcome to the What's Under the Bed holiday special. Today, I am interviewing the legendary filmmaker Brian Yuzna. Hope you enjoy it. Like, comment, subscribe, share, do all those things. Yeah, enjoy the video, and happy holidays from What's Under the Bed. My guest today is the legendary horror filmmaker Brian Yuzna, who has either produced, directed, written, or all of the above on horror classics like Re-Animator, From Beyond, Dolls, Society, Return of the Living Dead 3, The Dentist, Faust, DAGON, Bride of Reanimator, Beyond Reanimator, and so many more, including Ticks and 2 of the Silent Night, Deadly Night films with a friend of the show, Clint Howard. Brian, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So your father was a civil engineer for the United States government and worked various projects overseas. Your parents were living in the Philippines when you were born, and your parents moved back to the United States when you were 14 years old. But before that, you spent your childhood living in countries like Panama, Nicaragua, and Puerto Rico. What were you like as a child growing up in these exotic places?
Well, they weren't exotic to me. What was exotic was a couple times we visited northern Minnesota where my folks were born. That was exotic. It was cold up there, and they had things like apples and peaches growing on trees for pears. And where I lived was just tropical, always hot, and there were monkeys in the trees. I grew up without, well, I was in grammar school. I didn't have television until I was well into grammar school. And when it came to Panama, which was a third world country, it was just a few hours a day. So I didn't have, I never had that childhood with watching cartoons on Saturdays, which a lot of my contemporaries did. And so movies were a pretty big deal when you got to go to them. And I usually got to go every week, but we'd go to the matinee they had for kids in a nearby theater. But we would go on Sunday and see, they'd have 1 or 2 movies and like Three Stooges cartoons and some RKO serials. And so that was, and then we did get to go see other movies. But movies were a pretty big deal. Radio was ubiquitous. I listened to radio serials, and I read a lot of comics. And the earliest comics I bought when I was just a little kid were horror comics. So I think that definitely had something to do, or at least indicated that I had some innate interest in horror from the time I was a little kid.
Before the influence of movies, what scared you the most as a child? Was there a ghost in the attic or a monster in the closet?
I wasn't afraid of monsters. I don't know what I might have been afraid of. I wasn't afraid of something in the closet or anything like that. We did used to go out onto the streets at dusk, and in the tropics, when you get close to the equator, the days are always the days about 12 hours and the nights about 12 hours. So in the evening after dinner, kids would go out, and I lived in the cities. We didn't live in a US kind of neighborhoods, or, like army bases or something. I went to school in the Canal Zone or in Puerto Rico on an army base, naval base, but we lived in just the city. So all my friends in the neighborhood were all Panamanians, Puerto Ricans. But my friends at school there'd be a lot of Americans there. In the evenings, so of course I spoke Spanish in the neighborhood. And in the evenings, and somebody had always have a story that they had heard that their cousin, friend, or uncle or somebody had died, and then they would be, somehow they crawled out of the grave. There'd always be some kind of monkey's paw kind of story. And we didn't really question the veracity of it, but I thought that was pretty spooky. And I certainly wasn't looking, I didn't go out of my way to like go into a graveyard or something. So I think I was definitely spooked by that. But I think what the things that made me scared, that I remember being afraid of, were horror movies. From the first one I ever saw, which was The Creature with the Atom Brain. It really gave me the nauseous kind of physical feeling you get from horror, that skin crawling kind of stomach churning feeling. And I would go for nights I would have nightmares for nights. They would torture me. They would just obsess me. And as I saw more of them, by the time I got to be about 10, I think they quit making me sick and began to be a lot of fun, even though they'd be scary. And I wanted to be scared, but I wanted to be able to handle it as well.
There are many legends, myths, and superstitions from around the world. You lived in the Philippines, where they have balete trees, often believed to be the home to spirits and mysterious creatures. And you stayed in Panama, where some believe sinister supernatural beings called duendes lure children into joining them. And of course, Puerto Rico has the chupacabra. Do you remember any legends, myths, or superstitions like these when you were growing up?
Well, I left Philippines when I was like 2 or 3 years old, so that wouldn't count. The stories I heard, were, like I said, what I heard in the neighborhood, and so I did believe them. I also remember going to Boy Scout camp on the Chagres River in Panama. It's in the jungle, basically. And so you hear all the jungle noises and animals, and there's lots of monkeys and vines and stuff like that. And we would sleep in these, army surplus tents, these canvas pup tents. And we'd go sit under in the tropics. They, at least in Panama, they would make these thatched roof structures, just pole structures with a thatched roof, where you would take refuge from the sun or the rain, because it would rain a lot, and rains would be torrential in the tropics. And so that's where you would go to get out of the rain. Well, I remember that the scout leader that we had was a young guy, and I remember once, a memorable time, we all got in under the they call them a bohío, and we got all us kids got under it, and the scout leader told us some ghost stories. And boy, it scared me so much, I couldn't even go to my tent. I just would be too afraid to actually go anywhere. And so I think I think all kids are pretty afraid of stuff like that. But what it made me want to do is I'd go home and I'd tell the kids in the neighborhood, especially the younger kids, and I would tell the ghost stories, because I I was attracted to it. So I wanted to, you know, what really scared me, I wanted to do the same when I went home.
I read several scary movies really had an effect on you as a child. There was Dr. X with Fay Ray, the Ten Commandments, and Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, among others. Did your parents have any restrictions on what you were allowed to watch?
Well, after I saw The Creature with the Atom Brain and I was up with nightmares, my mother swore that she'd never let us go back to the kids' matinee on Sunday. But she quickly relented because it got everybody out of the house. And so I don't remember, well, you know, I mean, I would, you know, I have to admit, I would even sometimes sneak off with a friend and we'd go down probably in neighborhoods I shouldn't go and see movies. And when I was growing up, when I was in grammar school and even junior high, we kind of just, you know, sort of that cliche, I didn't have like really play dates or we on the weekend, or we just went out in the morning and I don't know, we took a ball in a bat, or we just go mess around and try not to get in trouble, but we would just go out and then come back when it was time to eat. So it's not like my parents, you know, I had 5 brothers and sisters, but my parents were pretty busy looking after a lot of little kids. And they didn't really, I don't remember them saying you can't see this movie or you can't read that book. I was a big reader. So I read when I think from the time I was learned to read, I just read all the Hans Christian Andersen and fairy tales and Brothers Grimm. And I think they are really precursor. I mean, they really fit into the horror genre because terrible things happen in fairy tales. So I never remember them saying you can't read this or you can't see that. I'm sure if they thought it was going to be very scary, they wouldn't let me see it. As a matter of fact, when I was, I guess I was about 12 or 13, was it 12? Just starting, I guess in the 6th grade, Psycho had just come out. We just moved to Puerto Rico and my mother took me to Psycho. And boy, that one, I couldn't take a shower for weeks. You know, that movie was just traumatic. Now I think it's just a great movie. I love it. And that seems to be what, that seems, people that, I think everybody is kind of a horror movie fan when they're like in junior high, going into high school, because horror's about sex and death. And puberty is when you become aware of those things, and it's and so they deal with that. And I think almost everybody likes horror at that time. But people like me who don't outgrow it, sometimes I think it could be something innate, and it also could be that you know, sometimes you get infected with the horror bug, and what just made you sick and miserable later becomes something that you look for. And the horror movies as you get older, of course, they don't work anymore. They don't give you that thrill anymore, but you still go looking for it and appreciating it when it can come close. So, but like I said, I don't think my parents ever, I never remember them saying I couldn't watch something. And unfortunately, I let my kids see all kinds of little, you know, all kinds of movies when I shouldn't.
Your family moved back to the United States when you attended high school. How much of your high school experience do you think informs who you are today?
How much of my high school experience?
Yes.
You mean in terms of my life in general?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, a lot, of course. On the one hand, it, you know, all of a sudden we moved to the United States. So now I felt like I was going home, like, because I always grew up as an outsider to a certain extent, because I was an American. You know, they called me a gringo, which was a pejorative term. So I thought, well, now we're going to the USA. I was desperate to be in the US culture, to be in the American culture. But then we moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and this was the time of the civil rights movement. And there was a lot of, that's when the marches were happening, like in Selma and Martin Luther King. And when I moved to Atlanta, you know, they had separate water fountains. And when I got on a bus, there'd be a sign that says colored to the back of the bus. Some restaurants had separate entrances, separate areas to eat for coloreds. My school was segregated, and it was pretty ugly. And it was shocking to me, because I realized that America wasn't the America of going up to northern Minnesota to the lakes that I did when I was a kid a couple times, where everybody, you know, small town in the northern Midwest. Instead, here, this was the South, and there was some ugly stuff that went on, and I started thinking that I understood the Panamanians more than I understood the Georgians. So that was kind of a shock to me. And I also didn't, it took me the first year to realize to be somewhere where there were 4 seasons, where there was a summer, fall, winter, and spring. I had never had that before. We just had the dry season and the rainy season. So that seems really stupid, but it was a big revelation to me to realize, because when I went to school in grammar school, we would cut out maple leaves in the fall, and we would, you know, have snowmen in the winter, you know, on the board. We'd make, you know, decorate the classroom. But that was just some, you know, it was not something we lived. It was an idea. So it was very, of course, it really, high school definitely is a big formative time. And I ended up going back to live when I finally started settling down. I went and moved to North Carolina, which is a southern state, because I guess I ended up feeling comfortable in the South because I knew it. And so it certainly, you know, high school affected me, but also what was happening at that time. It was the anti-war movement, Vietnam War, you know, kind of, civil disobedience, riots, burning down cities. It was quite a turbulent time. And I think that really, really affected me.
I've heard you say when you were in high school, kids wanted to grow up and write a great novel. It turns out all these years later, you did. This is your book, The Pope, released in 2022. What inspired you to write a novel, and what can you tell me about it?
Well, I didn't do it to write the great novel. What I meant by that is that in the 60s, that was a goal. And I'm not making, I mean, that's not my interpretation. I remember Time Magazine was a big magazine back then, Time and Newsweek. And they did a poll of, I think, college seniors or high school seniors, you know, and to see what their ambition was. And one of the great ambitions for rising senior, for the seniors, was to write the Great American Novel, which was sort of something from my parents' generation, to be a Hemingway, to be a Steinbeck. You know, the books were real important. So I was just drawing that distinction that today nobody reads books. I mean, some people read books, but it's not like it was. And now everybody wants to be a movie director. They want to make the big movie. And so we've really gone, you know, we've changed media, and that's very reflective of that book, because I wanted to make kind of an ironic sort of horror movie. Back, I don't know, I think it was about 15 years ago, there was a big scandal about clergy in the Catholic Church sexually abusing like kids in their charge, you know, like altar boys. And it was just such a horrible thing, you know, such a, it'd get you so upset to read about that, that I thought it would make a good horror movie. And I had remembered a story that a friend of mine named Jan Dunset in Amsterdam, who started the Amsterdam Horror Festival, movie festival. And he told me about taking Dario Argento, who was a, you know, real, you know, classic horror filmmaker from Italy, who did the giallos, some of the giallos. And he took him to the red light district in Amsterdam, which is where there's it's kind of legal bordello, but of many, many buildings and houses. I mean, it's a whole neighborhood. And there's windows where the women sit lit in whatever garb that they're promoting. And it's really amazing to see, you know. And when Dario Argento saw that, Jan said that he told him, he got real upset, and he says, the Pope must do something about this. And I thought, that's an interesting attitude, that somehow the Pope is going to come and clean this up. And I thought, well, that would make a good movie, to have the Pope be sort of an avenger. And I grew up Catholic in Panama. And so I'm very steeped in the mythology of the Catholic Church. So I just thought, oh, it would make a good idea for a horror story, but I guess it shouldn't be the Pope himself. I'll make it a seminary dropout who dresses up like the Pope to kill pedophile priests. And I got my friend John Penny, who wrote Return of the Living Dead 3. I see the poster behind you. And so we wrote a script based on it, on this idea. And I kind of knew it. I thought, well, nobody's ever going to finance this, but maybe we should make it multimedia, so it'd be more of something. So I wrote a novel based on the script, and of course that developed the story a lot. It enriched it a lot, and then we even did an issue of the first part of the movie as a comic book, and it was just kind of a way to extend the idea. And of course, one of the good things about having a book is that with scripts, you know, they're nothing if a movie isn't made. But with the book, it's at least a finished product. So that was the reason for writing that book.
Before we discuss your earlier work, let's talk about about what you've been doing now. Oh, hold on a second. let's see. This,
Oh,
these. Hold on. There we go.
oh, Tales of Blood Island.
So Terror is a Man, Brides of Blood, The Mad Doctor of Blood Island, and Beast of Blood made up the Blood Island series of Filipino horror movies produced in the 1960s by Eddie Romero and Kane Lin for their company Hemisphere Pictures. What can you tell me about this project?
Well, the project is my friend David Searing's project, and he's a horror fan. I met him because he ran a cable channel called Monsters HD back in the 2000s, and he licensed Reanimator to put on his monster channel. It was owned by AMC, the cable channel, and so we became friends because he's a horror fan, and he worked in corporate, and he was a corporate guy. But then after that, he started his own company and does some film sales and tries to set stuff up. And he got the rights to the Beast of Blood, the Blood Island movies. And he wanted to make a movie, like a reboot or a series, and asked me if I'd work with him on it, if I'd direct. And I agreed, and he wrote with another writer. He wrote a script, and then we decided to once again do a comic, because that makes it more of a project, and you can see what the movie is, and it's almost impossible. Getting people to read a script is just almost impossible. And if anything, a reader will read it and write a report. So if you have a comic book, and the comic book is I think the idea would be that the whole story would be told in 4 comics. You can see it. I don't know if you've seen the comic. Have you seen it?
Not yet.
So here's the comic, and so you can see that this comic just has a lot of action and a lot of monsters. There's
Oh, that's awesome.
So it's just chock full of so now you get, when you see the comic, you go, oh, now I know what that is. Now you know the movie, right? You go, oh, that's what you're talking about. And so when you're trying to get financing, it's better that you can go, look, this is what we want to do. If you want to do that, this is your thing. But if you don't want this, then we get it. But you don't have to bother reading a script and, devoting a lot of time to it. If it's something you're interested in, you'll see it right away. So then to do that, we did a Kickstarter, did crowdfunding to do the comic. And also David made, we had these, you see some of the merch, right? There's the tiki mug, which there's the whole subculture of people who love to collect tiki mugs, believe it or not.
Also, we've got these.
And oh, you got the.
We've got these too. Yeah.
And I think there's even a board game, or I don't know. He made a lot of stuff and a shirt. You know, there's a shirt, a Blood Island shirt with the images on it. And so that was and so it was basically done to one, you know, make a comic and hopefully have it crowdfunded, and then have merge to show what is possible with it, you know, because it's kind of not enough to just have a movie. You've got to show that there's a lot of ways to exploit this. So that's the purpose of Blood Island. And I think it's a great project. Dave really wants, I think it's a great project if it's done for a very reasonable budget. I think as a bigger budget thing, it doesn't really work, because the fun of it is to make it like those old movies. But of course, today with, you know, great effects but retro effects, you know, puppets and, you know,
practical effects,
and just lots of, you know, just action and monsters. I spent 3 years in Indonesia trying to make a movie line of films there, and got kind of shut down when the Great Recession happened and our financing fell through. But one of the things I wanted to do in Indonesia was just be able to make movies based on the kind of legends and myths that they have, because the Southeast Asia, like Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, they all share these certain monsters, and that, you know, they have their own versions of them. And so I just sometimes get tired of, you know, the serial killer, you know, the werewolf, the vampire, you know, it's just, I don't know, it's like to see something else, you know, see another take on these things. And so this really fits in to being able to do what I was trying to do in Indonesia. David wants to shoot it in the Philippines, which would probably be fine, but but I think we could shoot it very inexpensively in Bali, where I have shot before. But, you know, who knows? Maybe it'll get made.
You're also the executive producer on an untitled H.P. Lovecraft body swap movie that just wrapped. It is directed by JOE Lynch and stars Heather Graham and Barbara Crampton, who is on fire right now. Her work in your movies, Reanimator and From Beyond, made her a horror icon. Now with her roles in movies like You're Next and Jacob's Wife, she's become an icon all over again. What can you tell us about this project, and when can we see it, and is there a name yet?
Well, the project began as a project I was doing. I was trying to make a label, a group of films, and I called it the 7 Deadly Sins of Horror. This was in the 90s. And I wanted to make a series of horror movies based on the deadly sins, and get a classic horror director to each take a sin, and then put classic actors in it, and do a whole like a Hammer Films thing. And I had directors on board like Dario Argento and George Romero and Stuart Gordon and Richard Stanley and a number of Mary Lambert, and everybody would take a sin. And so Stuart chose the sin of envy, and we decided to adapt The Thing on the Doorstep, a Lovecraft story, for it. And so the Thing on the Doorstep is a body swap movie. Story, if you haven't read it. And it's a good one. It's a good story. And so Dennis Paoli wrote a script for it. he and Stuart worked out a story. Dennis wrote a script, but then the project never happened, and that became just another script, another story that didn't get made. Barbara was looking for a project after Jacob's wife with her producing partner, Bob Portal. And she asked if there was something that I had or that I had with Stuart. And I suggested that a good movie to make would be to do the script that Dennis Paoli had written. And so it was called The Thing on the Doorstep. No, he might have called it, well, anyway, it was either called Thing on the Doorstep or Envy, depending on who you're submitting it for. And they updated it and made it about a psychiatrist. Then Barbara optioned it, and then they had and I think she already had, early on she got Lynch as a director, and times being what they are, they decided to flip all the characters so that it was female centric. They changed the characters to women, the main characters. And that's why you have Heather Graham and Barbara could then star in it. The title at that time was A Suitable Flesh. And they got a deal for financing it and for distribution. And I guess, and the shooting was done last May in Mississippi. At this point, a new title is being looked for. I think maybe A Suitable Flesh maybe is a little too artistic. But it should be done, I think, by the beginning of the year.
You attended college in the 1960s during a time of upheaval and an explosion in culture. You said the mantra on campus was to turn on, tune in, and drop out. There was so much art, music, and expression during this time. Sorry, what were you going to say something? Oh, sorry. Largely focused on protest against the war and societal norms. We are living in a time now where the country is polarized and flirting with the idea of another civil war. Why do you think there aren't more protest songs now?
Well, maybe I think, well, it's different times for sure. I think maybe a lot of rap or hip hop, rap type music might have a lot of protest in it, but there certainly aren't anthems. And I think there's kind of I don't think that there's not a youth culture the way there was then. That was kind of an emerging thing, and there's no draft. So the thing that really united all the different youth, different types of youths in the 60s was the draft. It's this thing about being anti-war. And the reason for that was they were just drafting you and sending you to Vietnam. And we all, got out of high school. You had to try to get your deferment. And we knew people who went over there and died and got shipped home to your friends, got shipped home in a body bag. And so there was a big, it kind of united a lot of people. Right now, the threat is much, there isn't that kind of unifying threat. And I mean, now it's so much different because of social media and also the embrace of celebrity culture and consumerism. It's just such a different time. The threat back then, the kind of the Civil War back then was anti-war, and then it was certainly civil rights. The Civil Rights Act caused a lot of people in the streets, and there was, you had people on the left that wanted to overthrow the government. The far left were the Weathermen and the SDS and Black Panthers, and all these, you know, the more extreme parts. The middle of the left was take care of poor people, racial equality, you know, gay rights, and that sort of thing. But the extreme left was Marxist. It was, we need a revolution. We got to get the guns out, and we've got to, you need a revolution to transform the government to the People's Republic of whatever. Today, it's all on the right. There's still those elements in the left that are, but it's so small, you know, they're just not ascendant. And today, it's the crazy, you know, the extreme right that is, that wants to, you know, attack the government and, you know, go right, you know, riot in Congress and, you know, shoot the libs, and, you know, there's sort of this white nationalism that is the big danger today. But except for the fact that things are so different today because of social media, and the sort of the demise of these like newspapers and mainstream media that would kind of tamp down, not give such a voice to the crazies. Today, like back in the 60s, you had underground papers, you had political newspapers in every city that combined culture like rock and roll, drugs, and politics. Today, there are no newspapers anymore. It's all online, and people from all over people of the same craziness from all over the country can get together on Facebook or something and spread any kind of nonsense they want. And then there's a whole industry that makes money off of that monetizes this nuttiness, this, the lizard people and, the groomers. And I mean, the conspiracy theories have always been there. I don't think that there is qualitatively any difference between the craziness of the right today, the MAGAs. It's pretty much exactly what was happening in the 50s with McCarthyism. That segment of right-wing extremism has always been around. It's just that now it's hit a critical mass, and it seems very. In the 60s, it did feel like things were just going to fall apart, and today it sort of feels like that again too.
A follow-up question to the song part of the question. Do you think more songs have been written about love, lust, or heartbreak?
Probably heartbreak.
I've heard you say horror deals with problems of adolescence and coming of age. Can you explain that?
Well, I don't think you have to explain to a 14-year-old what it's like to be a werewolf. Growing hair all over, your body's changing, you have impulses that are kind of shocking. For girls, they have menstruation or bleeding, there's change in their bodies, they have impulses that they might be shocked by. I think that's, it's also the sex goes along with death. I mean, even on a cellular level, there's only cell division until there's two hosts for offspring. And once you get sex, which means there's a male and a female to create the offspring instead of just cell division, well, those two die. So there is a kind of a philosophical kind of argument that sex and death occur at the same moment. You don't really have death until you have sexual reproduction. I think vampires are very, also very sexually, deathly oriented. The way have always been expressed in, at least in more modern times, it's been kind of going more towards a homosexual kind of aspect to things, or a ambisexual, non-binary kind of thing. Even if you read Anne Rice's The Interview with the Vampire, you remember that he, the vampire had to go to Europe to look for his own. And he found the vampires in Eastern Europe prowling the graveyards and eating dead bodies. So when he went to Paris, they were gay and they had a theater and they only ate blood and more highfalutin stuff. And which also just shows you how the zombie genre and vampirism are part of the same continuum. A zombie is just a vampire that has bad taste.
After college, I believe you spent some time in a commune, then tried your hands at a few professions and started several businesses. You worked as a carpenter, you sold paintings, owned an art supply store and a sandwich shop. You invested in real estate, Christmas trees, even pumpkins for Halloween. I would imagine all of these projects prepared you for a career in filmmaking. One of the most important endeavors was photography. Would you tell me how lending out a camera led you to making a short film and ultimately Re-Animator?
Well, first of all, I never actually joined a commune, but I lived in a neighborhood of communes. I've never been a very good joiner, and plus, I always had a job, and that was kind of not, that was sort of politically incorrect within certain leftist communes. But that was certainly the world I lived in. I always was interested in art. And so I was always involved with that. And I learned, I took studio art classes in university. And then I tried, like you said, I painted, had art show, sold paintings. I tried a lot of different stuff. Well, at one point, I had a Nikon camera that I had bought very cheaply from a friend. And so so I was doing photography. I had a dark room and I was doing like art photography. I wasn't like, working as a photographer, trying to do, portraits or whatever. I was interested in the whole process of photography and dark rooms and developing film. And then my friend that had sold me this camera borrowed it to go, I think he was going to Mexico or something. And it was stolen at the airport. So he came back and he said, hey, that your camera got stolen, but I'm going to give you this instead. He's not going to pay me what the camera was worth because he knows what I paid for it. So instead, he gave me a 16mm Bolex camera. And at that time, it was just the beginning of videotape becoming portable. In the 60s and 50s, they had video cameras, they had television cameras that were in a studio and they didn't have very good resolution. Resolution took a lot of light and they were very bulky. Well, by the time we got into the 70s, they had developed videotape. And the videotape, they were able to bring it down to a 3/4 inch tape, which is much smaller than the 2-inch that they started with. And so they built video cameras that you could do news for. Well, up till then, news cameras, when a news crew went out, they had these little Bolex cameras and they were wind up. So you'd wind it up and you'd get about, I think, 100 feet of film through it. You could do a few minutes, forget how many minutes the tape could be before you had to change it. And there were 3 lenses on it. So you could just turn it to get the lens. There was, you know, it wasn't a see-through, it wasn't a single reflex lens. So you were just looking through an eyepiece that mimicked what you would see. And there was no, you'd have to take sound separately, of course, but you didn't need batteries or anything like that. And it was 60mm film. So if you know, that was what they shot news on. But as they went into doing news on video, which you could just shoot and edit in the studio, you didn't have to take it to a lab to develop or anything. They just started dumping 16mm, those Bolexes. And so my friend had picked one up because they were just so cheap. And so he gave me that instead. So then I started shooting with that. I got film and I started shooting. And I had a 60mm projector. And at that time I lived on a river on about 120 acres. I was just renting a little house there. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And I had a big field and I had kind of a couple of guard turkeys and a bunch of goats. I had a kind of a herd of goats because goats will keep the snakes away. And I would shoot, you know, the goats and the turkey. And I had a goat that I would have to put him on put a rope around his collar and put a tire so he couldn't get across the fence. Because if he did, he'd get out. All the rest of them would follow him and he'd get inside my house. And then my house would be full of goats when I got home at night. And, but this, you know, this goat, he was a billy with alpine with these wicked, like ram-like horns. And he would wind himself up. And when I'd come home, I'd have to go undo him. Of course, he would attack me. He'd be so angry. So I would shoot film of this and I watch it on my 16mm projector and it just looked incredible to me. And I thought, man, this is like Bergman, you know, because in the 60s, everything was art, you know, it was new wave. It was all these art movies. And so I saw this and thought, man, this is great. This is like Bergman. And so I was really taken with it. And then at one point I decided I'd make a movie and I got a book and I wrote a short script and I found somebody who had actually gone to school and learned about film production and had him help me. And that's kind of what got me going. You know, I made a short film, which I thought was just incredible. And it was just, I just thought it was so great. We went through the whole process, sound, whole thing. And then when I put it on a VHS and I showed it to my friends, from the minute I started watching it with them, all of a sudden I realized it actually wasn't very good at all. Until then, I thought it was wonderful. And so, like an idiot, instead of just saying, okay, I've done that, now I'm going to try a new one. I thought, no, since I made a bad short film, I'll just keep adding to it till it's a bad feature. And so that's what I did. And that got me into reading Box Office Magazine, Variety, and I just got really, it was the most fun. It was the most interesting thing I had tried to do. And so it was better than still photography, painting, any of the other. I loved almost everything I did to make. I always had to make money, and so but whatever I did, I liked it. I generally worked for myself, and but the movie thing, I just thought, man, the best thing would be to be able to make a living making movies, and so so that's what I tried to do. Fortunately, I was able to do that.
Reanimator, Bride of Reanimator, and Beyond Reanimator all deal with zombies of sort. Return of the Living Dead 3 was a sequel to an unofficial remake of the greatest zombie movie, Night of the Living Dead. I believe you even have a project in development called I Walk with Zombies. Do you prefer fast zombies or slow zombies?
You know, I guess I'm a little more into I'm not that much into I like the macabre zombies. So the thing I like about zombies or Living Dead or whatever is the idea that they are kind of dying or dead. They're soulless, because ultimately, if you think about it, say with Reanimator, bringing back a dead body, why do they behave so badly? And if you die on the operating table and they zap you back, you don't all of a sudden start wanting to kill people. And so that's kind of what, you know, I like the kind of zombies like in Dawn of the Dead, where the tagline was, when hell is full, the dead will walk the earth. I always like that macabre part of it. I'm not as big a fan of zombies as a disease, which is kind of what we have now, or something like The Walking Dead, which is basically a soap opera with gore. That's not, you know, 28 Days Later was a very important zombie movie because it did make them go fast, and it did introduce this idea that strictly that it was a disease, you know. Dan O'Bannon's take on Return of the Living Dead was that it was a gas, you know, that would kill you, but you would still be, you'd know you were dead. You'd still be mobile. And I tried to deal with the mythology of that in both Return of the Living Dead and Beyond Reanimator, to try to come up with my own mythology of what that's about. So if you were going to say fast or slow, I guess I would prefer slow, but not strictly. I just think that they shouldn't be. I don't think it's necessary. I mean, I liked in Return of the Living Dead where Dan would have them all kind of rushing a victim, you know, and running. I think that's fine. I think it's less about whether they go fast or slow than what, you know, what's going on with them.
Reanimator, many of your projects are from the stories of H.P. Lovecraft. He's an author I have been reading a lot of lately, but he's a challenging read. What would you say to prepare anyone who was about to tackle reading his works?
Well, don't expect Stephen King. Stephen King writes books that read like movies. Lovecraft comes from an era, and even in his time, he considered himself that he would have much rather have been born 100 years earlier. He was more interested in the past, you know, more of a Edgar Allan Poe type of past. The thing about Lovecraft is that the words are the final product. And with most modern writing, at least genre writing, or you know, they're basically almost like they're written to be movies. They're written in images and scenes. Poe and Lovecraft, they didn't write, you know, the plot isn't the end all. It's about the mood that they instill in you as you read it. It's more like a piece of music or something that can bring you into a recognition of horror. Lovecraft liked horror. He also wrote fantasy stuff, upbeat, fantastical, non-horror stuff, but it's not famous. You know, people don't like it as much. What has attracted his biggest audience is the horror, and he did a horror that was kind of non-religious, and he created he incorporated the science of the time, and he did what they call now cosmic horror. It's the feeling that you get if you read him. It's not easy to read him. A lot of his stories just, you can read it through, and when you're finished, I could ask you, what was the plot? What happened? And you probably couldn't say it. Read a Lovecraft story and then ask yourself, okay, what happened? The other part of it is his writing style is of its time and even before its time. So he's writing almost archaically, and he's trying to evoke, you know, weird legends and histories and strange gods. And I think that's the kind of, it's not easy to read. It's hard. I didn't really read. I had read some Lovecraft, but I wasn't much attracted until I made Reanimator. And Reanimator, the stories are very un-Lovecraftian. They're more like monkey's paw stories. They're real traditional kind of, you know, people crawling out of their grave type of story. It's not, you know, it's not anything Lovecraft was particularly proud of, but it was accessible. It made a good horror movie. And because it was Lovecraft, and that then I decided with Stuart Gordon that, oh, let's make a series of Lovecraft movies in the same way as Roger Corman made the Poe series that I was just fascinated with when I was in junior high. Let's just do a series of Lovecraft, and that's why we did From Beyond. And then I started reading a lot of Lovecraft. So I just read everything I could. And then I became a fan, because once I got used to it and put the focus on it and got into it, it was really, you know, really good. It reminds me a little bit of when I was a teenager. I read ghost stories. I read any kind of horror, whatever. And I had, of course, I read the classics, which would be, you know, Frankenstein and Dracula. And I found Dracula, that Bram Stoker's Dracula. I thought it was just great. That, you know, especially the opening part of the book, Jonathan Harker's journal, is real horror. It's really great. I loved it. Then when I tried Frankenstein, I was like dismissive. It was just terrible. It wasn't at all like the movie. It was just so hard to read, and, you know, it just wasn't very entertaining. But so I kind of just dismissed it. But when I make movies, I usually do a lot of my own research. I follow ideas to try to make the movie. I don't want the movie to show that. I want the movie to just be entertaining and look like, you know, that it's just entertaining and natural and easy. But usually I develop ideas I do a lot of, you know, sort of I always see a movie as being like an iceberg where 9/10 of it is underwater. So 9/10 of the movie isn't on, it's informing. So when I was going to make Bride of Reanimator, I looked at, I was studied Frankenstein, the movie Frankenstein, because I wanted to see how, you know, James Whale went from Frankenstein to Bride of Frankenstein, because I'm calling this Bride of Reanimator. And then that led me to reading the book again. And I read a edition of it that had ink drawings by Bernie Wrightson to illustrate, you know, they would, every chapter would have a Bernie Wrightson page where he would do a scene, which was really great. But by then I was in my 30s and my late 30s actually. And all this, and I was always wondering, I thought, how could a book like like Frankenstein be so interesting that it would make Boris Karloff pull his molars to have a more sunken mouth? I mean, it seemed very extreme for a horror movie. And so I kind of wanted to read it again. And when I read it, all of a sudden maybe it was because I was older. I had more patience. I could concentrate a little more. I was really taken by the theme. I quit wanting it to be the movie and worrying about the plot so much. And I wanted to, and I was really interested in this theme about someone who feels like they've been rejected by their creator. And so that became the theme for me of Bride of Reanimator. I thought, oh, it'll be kind of a love story. And she'll be rejected by her creator. And so that's, I think, the key scene in that movie is when she's trying to get Dan Kane to accept her. And, you know, when she says, is this what you want? You know, she pulls her heart out because her heart is actually Meg's heart, who Dan is really in love with. It's his old dead girlfriend. And so I think there's a poignancy there. I mean, I think it's just really sad, you know, that she's being rejected. And then West echoes that theme when he does his speech about when the other character says, oh, you're blaspheming against God. And he says, you know, against what God? A God that has rejected us, you know? What has he got to do with it? And I think there is a sense, you know, that I think almost any kid can identify with it, because at one point you got to leave your childhood, you got to leave, you know, your parents, or just the idea that your parents don't approve of you, or if they discipline you, or if they, you know, or anytime you've been rejected. And I think with, you know, socially, the parental relationship would be the one that is it would be the strongest for that. But there is a existential idea there too, which is that, you know, well, if there's a God that created all this, why did he make it so bad? It just seems like he forgot about us. Said, God, this humanity, what a mess. I'm going to just let them, you know, do what they want. So that's the theme, I think, in the book of Frankenstein, because he makes the creature, and then he finds him disgusting. And in Bride of Frankenstein, the same thing happens. You think about it, the monster is going to get a bride, a wife, you know, a woman, and he's just all in love with her. But when she comes to life, she finds him ugly and despicable and totally rejects him. And that's why he destroys the lab and everything. So that was the, you know, that was the impetus for you know, that was the theme of Bride of Reanimator.
So we did pass an hour, but I have a few questions left. Is it okay to continue?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Your first short film, then long form film, was called Self-Portrait in Brains. Is there anywhere someone could watch this?
I sure hope not. Or the alternate answer is not if I have anything to do about it. You don't really want to watch Quentin Tarantino's first movie either.
The Great Masturbator, Metamorphosis of Narcissus, Soft Construction with Boiled Beans. These are the names of 3 masterpieces by the Surrealist painter, Salvador Dali. What role did these paintings play in the creation of your own masterpiece and directorial debut, Society?
Well, when I got the script for Society, which I really liked the paranoia in, but it didn't have any fantastical element. And at that time in the 80s, I just loved, you know, what I call the rubber guys were doing in Hollywood. These they're usually heavy metal guys that made monsters for the movies. And we got to see new stuff every time a new Nightmare on Elm Street would come out. They would do more weird effects. I think it kind of started, you know, they were basically playing with rubber, with methylcellulose and foam latex and all these different types of rubbers and mechanical rigs, puppets. And so one of the things I was a big Surrealist fan when I was growing up. And as a matter of fact, the first poster for From Beyond was based on a Dali painting. It's not the one that was finally used, but you know, even on that movie, I tried to bring Surrealism into it. And some of the effects we did in From Beyond, we did a lot of kind of rubbery goop effects at one point. And that stuff, I've always just really liked it. I'm a big effects fan. I like to see fantastical stuff in the movies. And so I wanted something, I figured if I'm gonna get to direct something, I want to do some kind of effect that I've never seen before. And so I tried to imagine something, and what came to my mind was flesh melding together. And so I took that idea, and I was recommended to meet by the movie was financed by Japanese companies. And they suggested I meet this Japanese effects artist that was working in Hollywood named Screaming Mad George. And I went to meet him, and he was an artist, painter and sculptor, and he was all into Dali as well. So we just immediately, you know, got together on that basis. And I wanted to have this melding, and I had some scenes in my mind. And so he used his style to start making maquettes, which are little models of things we could do based on the script the scenes that I was developing with the writers, Woody Keith and Rick Fry. And so we called it The Shunting. And so instead of it being a blood cult at the end of the movie, it becomes more of a science fiction type of monster which I thought was great, because I felt like I was able to create a new monster. It didn't have to be like, I figured nobody had made Class be the monster. And so it was just it was a whole load of fun. And a lot of the biggest image, the big image of The Shunting is from a Dali painting. And a lot of the images in there are Dali-esque.
Is there any news to share about a sequel to Society?
Well, you know, I have a hard time getting money for movies these days. But I was working for a while. There was a British company that had optioned the rights to do a series, a limited series based on society, and that didn't happen. I did come up with a sequel that takes place in the nightclub scene, the exclusive nightclub scene around, you know, like on Sunset Strip and Hollywood Boulevard, Beverly Hills. And I really like it. At this point, I'm working with the original writer of the Society movie, the original script, who's now called Seth Daniel. And we are actually writing a novel based on the original movie. We're almost done. And then I hope that, and I wrote a pretty involved treatment with John Penny, the guy who I worked with on Return of the Living Dead 3 and The Pope, and we wrote a treatment for a sequel that I think I really like it. And so I'm almost thinking that at least I'll maybe write a novelization of that script with Seth after we finish the novel. But I'd love to see it get made.
There's so much online about how to make a movie, but almost nothing about how to finance and find distribution for a movie. I've heard you say to understand movies, you must know about these things. How can someone learn about this side of the industry?
Well, it's tough to read about it because it's always constantly changing and it just seems too complicated. I remember when I was starting, when I wanted to make movies, I was already in my 30s and I didn't have I'd never taken a class, or I don't never remember it seeming to be some kind of option. Because it was, you know, who would know about it? You'd have to, if you grew up in LA and your family was somehow in the movie business, which I know a lot of people like that, then it's part of your world. You know, it's like, how do you make money as a farmer? You know, well, if you grow up in a farming family, you kind of know a way to make money farming. And farming isn't really the way farming was 100 years ago. It's agribusiness. So there's a lot of, so with the movie business, it's like any other business. It's very complicated and constantly changing. But when I started making movies, I wanted to make money at it. I wasn't a 20-year-old that just wanted to write the great American novel or something. I didn't want to make the great movie. I just liked the process. And I thought, wow, I just like to make a living making movies. So how do you do that? It means the movies have to return more money than they cost. If you can show somebody how they're going to get their money back, there's a ton of money out there just looking for something to invest in. And everybody has some, you know, that has a lot of money, has a little bit of mad money that they'd love to have in the movies, but they don't want to lose their money unless they're, you know, maybe you have a rich uncle or something who will go, hey, I'll pay for a movie for you because you're my relative, which is the way a lot of first timers get movies made. But if you don't have that, or if your rich relative says, you know, I'll put up the money, but I can't lose it all. I've got to have I want a fighting chance. I don't mind if the odds are against me, but I want to see that there's a plan to get my money back. It's very difficult to show that plan. It wasn't always like that. I was fortunate enough that I just happened to get into it at the beginning, at the video revolution time, when all of a sudden there was this whole new way of distributing movies, which was that you made a videotape out of it and you could rent it to people. You could sell it to video stores, these mom and pop stores. And everybody was buying Betamaxes and VHS recorders to record things off the air. And then they wanted to see movies on it. It was a big, it was the big thing. It was like the iPhone in 2005 or something. It was just a game changer. And once you got that player, which is basically a movie theater or a TV studio, well, you got to have something to play on. And so people would go to a video store and they would generally rent them because they were so expensive back then. But there wasn't much on. At the beginning, it was basically porn. And then they started getting old movies or movies that were in the public domain because the actual studios wouldn't let their movies be shown, be put on VHS because they thought it was a threat to their theatrical business. Same response that they had when TV came in the late 40s and 50s. So they wouldn't let their movies be put on VHS. And what that meant was that there was a big opportunity for independents to make a movie and put it on VHS. And so all these, every video store that opened up had to buy 3,000 videotapes somewhere to fill their store because people were going to come in on Friday night and look through them and pick out whatever there was. Well, this need became fulfilled by people who were collectors and could put public domain stuff on. For example, Night of the Living Dead. One reason it's so prominent, so famous, is because George Romero didn't put the copyright notice on properly on the print. So there was no copyright on it, which meant anybody could put it out on video. And so it was everywhere. And It's a Wonderful Life is another movie that wouldn't be so famous if it hadn't gone into the public domain. But in the meantime, there was a lot of companies popping up and making movies basically for video. You wanted them to go theatrical, but the money was in video. And what was happening in this country was happening around the world, where there's movie markets. And the one that I first went to was called the American Film Market. They still have it in the fall every year in Santa Monica. But what I learned when I went there was that movie companies would rent a stand, and then people from all over the world would come and license those movies to release on video in their country. And they would even pay you money up front to lock in their territory, give you 10% of the contract to hold it. And so you could actually pre-sell movies. And in the middle of the 60s, beginning and middle of the 60s, was just the Wild West for making independent movies. There was so many companies popping up to invest in movies. And even into the 90s, you could literally say, look at this, here's our script. We can look at the territories, we know what our budget is, and each territory was sort of a percentage of the budget. And so you could show to an investor, you could say, look at, if you put up this money, this is how we're going to get it back. Of course, what happened was the studios decided they wanted in. And so eventually, and the video stores became monopolized by a few big chains like Blockbuster. And in the 90s, towards the height of Blockbuster, the independent studios would even give their scripts to Blockbuster before they made them to get notes, because they had their income was really dependent on how much shelf space Blockbuster would give them. And all the independent video stores kind of fell by the wayside because they couldn't compete against the big chains. And then it became harder and harder to compete against the studios who were now putting everything out on video. And so through the 90s, it got harder and harder to be an independent. You wanted to work for a bigger company who could get distribution, who could afford to put out movies. And once we got to the later 90s, the video business was kind of stagnant until DVD came in, and then that gave a boost again, but it was inevitably going to be taken over by streaming as soon as there was enough broadband. It's what happened with the music industry in the 90s, because music takes so much such a small amount of bandwidth compared to movies. The music industry got eaten up by streaming way earlier than movies did. It took movies about 15 years to get the bandwidth that you could have in Netflix, which is basically, until recently, was basically the Blockbuster of streaming. And once music was online, everybody can get it for free. And everybody starts expecting to get their entertainment for free. And record sales just plummeted. And then all of a sudden, musicians started having to go out and play in front of audiences to get any money again. They couldn't just make studio albums. And so the music industry went through this before movies. And now with streaming, there's no video anymore except for collectors. And so there's no physical video. And so with streaming, it's all free if you subscribe, and they don't even give numbers as to how many viewers they have. That's all secret to the corp, to Netflix or Disney Plus or whoever. And so your movie isn't worth much unless your movie is going to drive subscribers. So it's a very difficult time, I think. And most people who make independent movies are trying to get attention at a festival or something. They're trying to, it's buying a lottery ticket, and they're trying to get recognized as an up and comer, and so that they can maybe join the club of people who get hired to make movies. It's the odds are really against you. And especially if what you're trying to do is just make a living making movies. It's almost like you have to be in the game of trying to kind of win the lottery. Make a movie that everybody loves, and that they're gonna hire you to be the next Steven Spielberg or whoever.
This last question is a Sophie's Choice. Two must die so that one may live. House on Haunted Hill, The Creature with the Atom Brain, or Dr. X?
Oh, House on Haunted Hill. Dr. X is not a good movie. It has a good scene in it, and it has some style at the beginning, but it's just a clunky, stupid movie. It's 1931, I think, but it was directed by Michael Curtiz. I mean, a really great filmmaker. Creature with the Atom Brain is not it's a better movie than Dr. X, I think. At least, I mean, it's interesting, but I used to just be a little bit embarrassed that was the movie that my first horror movie, because I thought, God, couldn't it have been something better than that, something more impactful? No, 7 Points of Sinbad, I totally embraced, because that's a great movie. But House on Haunted Hill was a very special movie for me, because it was really the first horror movie that was just made for me at my age. It had the scares, it had the macabre, and it was just, you know, something that I could get on top of. It was just a lot of fun. And so I would always go for House on Haunted Hill.
Well, thank you for sitting down with me. Is there anything you want to ask me before we go?
What movie are you gonna make?
Actually, my dad wrote a script that's kind of just like a play off of Jaws, called Utter Madness. It's basically Jaws, but with a cow. And I want to make that as a movie.
That sounds pretty crazy. Well, that sounds like a good one to start with.